let's read some history. So this is page 175, chapter 18, East and West Collide. Please follow along with me and pause me if you need to get there. The Ottomans look west twice. Peter wasn't the only Eastern king to look toward the west. To the south of Russia, Peter's enemies, the Ottoman Turks, were also ruled by a king who hoped to make his empire more western. But even before that king came to the throne, the Turks tried to become more western, by conquering the west. When Peter became Tsar of Russia, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the modern-day country of Iraq all the way over to the borders of Austria, the German state where the Holy Roman Emperor lived. The Ottoman Turks were a proud Eastern people, followers of Islam. Their king, or sultan, ruled over the empire without question, and also guarded the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. The sultan kept private royal guards called the janissaries, who would carry out any deed their sultan ordered. In 1683, the year after Peter became Tsar, the Turks decided to make the West part of their Eastern Empire and began to march toward Europe. 250,000 Turkish soldiers were headed toward Vienna, the capital of the German state of Austria. The Holy Roman Emperor lived in Vienna. If the Turks could capture Vienna, they would own the heart of the West. The Viennese people panicked. All of the noblemen fled with their treasure. Houses in front of the walls were knocked down so that there would be no room to fight. The Holy Roman Emperor sneaked out of the city along with his family. The Viennese stood on the walls waiting for the worst. And then they saw the long, frightening line of Turks rise slowly over the horizon. The footsteps of this enormous army shook the earth. They broke against the earth like waves of the sea, one Viennese man wrote. The Ottoman army set up a siege camp all around Vienna. The army's leader, the vizier, prime minister, Kara Mustafa, put up a whole network of tents with fancy silk covers, rich rugs, and gardens planted around them. Kara Mustafa did not intend to leave his camp anytime soon. The Turks started digging trenches toward the walls of Vienna, sheltering themselves by putting timbers and earth over their heads. The Viennese were told to listen carefully for any sound of tunneling from underneath the city's pavements. As soon as they heard the sound of digging, German soldiers would try to break through the stones into the tunnels, fighting the Turks hand to hand in the dark, cramped underground before they could break through into the city. One morning, long before dawn, 2 bakers were preparing the day's bread. One baker kneaded the dough, while the other stoked the oven. Vienna still slept. The city was quiet. Suddenly, the kneader paused. He could hear an odd sound. Click, scoop, click, scoop. Turkish soldiers were tunneling beneath the bakery. "Help!" he yelled. "Invaders, help! Stop them!" German soldiers came running. They pried up the bakery stones and leapt down into the tunnels below, shouting and firing. The Turkish tunnelers were driven back. Vienna was safe for one more day. According to legend, the bakers invented a new kind of bread in honor of the occasion, rolls shaped like the crescent emblem of the Turkish flag, which they called croissants. But no one thought Vienna would last much longer. The siege dragged on. The people had run out of meat. They were eating donkeys and stray cats. Ugh. Many had begun to grow ill, and no one seemed to be coming to the rescue. The Turks went on digging trenches. At any moment, a huge assault could pour over Vienna's crumbling walls and bring the city down. Meanwhile, an army of French and Polish and German soldiers were slowly assembling. Finally, on September 11, 1683, the army was in position. The next morning, the European attack began. German and Polish soldiers pressed their way into the Turkish camp. The camp collapsed. Kara Mustafa fled. Despite all that Turkish strength, the army had stayed too long. It was slow, disorganized, and easy to drive away. When Kara Mustafa returned home, the Sultan ordered his head brought to court in a velvet bag. The attack on Vienna was the last great attack of the Ottoman Turks. The empire began to shrink. The German armies drove them back east, out of the modern country of Hungary. The western side of the empire disappeared. The distance between east and west was widening once more. But But 25 years later, a new sultan and his grand vizier tried once more to narrow that distance. Like Peter the Great, Ahmed III admired Western culture and Western ideas. He was a particular fan of Dutch tulips. Tulips had been a wildflower in Central Asia, where the Turks originally came from. As a matter of fact, a wild tulip was the sign of the Ottoman ruling house. Dutch explorers found the tulips and took them back to the Netherlands, where Dutch gardeners grew them, cultured them, and turned them into one of the world's greatest flowers. Now, Ahmed brought tulips back to the Turks. He had thousands and thousands of tulip bulbs brought from the Netherlands and placed in his royal palace. Hundreds of gardeners tended the bulbs. In April, when the tulips bloomed, Ahmed threw enormous parties among his tulip beds. Colored lamps hung in the gardens. Beautiful music was played from the garden's edges. He invited Western diplomats to these parties. The French ambassador described the scene he saw. Beside every fourth flower stood a candle. Along the alleys are huge cages filled with all kinds of birds. The trellises are all decorated with an enormous quantity of flowers of every sort, placed in bottles and lit by an infinite number of glass lamps in different colors. Not a very good French accent. Streams ran by the tulip beds. Giant turtles swam in them, bearing candles on their backs. For his love of tulips, Ahmed III became known as the Tulip King, and his reign became known as the Tulip Period. For 10 years, the Tulip King and his Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, tried to shape the Ottoman court after the courts of the West. The Sultan's new palace, Saadat, or the Palace of Happiness, was modeled after a French palace. Ibrahim Pasha sent ambassadors to French cities and factories to find out more about European art and science. The ambassadors brought back a printing press. For the first time, the Turks began to publish books, dictionaries, books about science, and a book about the military strategies of Western armies. Ahmed's court never became as Western as Peter the Great's. Women in Ahmed's empire still wore the robes and veils dictated by their Muslim faith. The Ottoman Turks kept their distinctive turbans and beards. They continued to worship in the ways of Islam. But the court became too Western for the Janissaries. In 1730, 5 years after the death of Peter the Great, Janissaries had had enough of Ibrahim Pasha, Ahmed III, and the luxury of the royal court. They rioted, burned down Ahmed's palace, and threw the Sultan in jail. They put Ahmed's nephew, Mahmud I, on the throne instead. Under Mahmud I, the Ottoman Turks were in no danger of becoming Western, but neither did they prosper. In the years to come, territories that belonged to the Turks, the states that we now call Balkan, such as Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, broke away one by one. Today, the country of Turkey is the last remnant of the huge Eastern Empire of the Ottoman Turks.